topics. So again, I'm Roger Mark D'Souza. I'm the Director of Population, Environmental Security and Resilience here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I'd like to start by introducing Alice Hill, who will kick us off this afternoon. And Alice has joined the White House National Security Council staff in September 2013 as the Senior Advisor for Preparedness and Resilience to the Assistant to the President for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism. So working within the administration, Alice's role very much is thinking about how these issues are important for preparedness and resilience and what it means for support and initiatives that the administration can take. So Alice, we're delighted to have you here with us. I'd like to invite you up for some opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger Mark. It's really my pleasure and honor to be here today and to see this very distinguished panel that is, I'm sure, going to have many good ideas for where the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program should head for the next score of years. So I think we should all say congratulations and happy birthday. This is a very auspicious day. ECSP, I think for those of you in the audience, you already know this, but it has been a keen issue spotter for many years. Its programs provide timely, exciting content. They bring policy analysts, makers together to figure out what are the challenges ahead and what we should be doing to address them. That is really the hallmark of what they do, and they do it so very well. In fact, the fact that they're celebrating 20 years is particularly evidence of that, that they know how to make sure to engage those that need to be engaged. So I've seen it firsthand, whether in briefings with international policymakers about building resilience to climate change, an area that I care deeply about, or in conversations with critical stakeholders ranging from soldiers to mayors to scientists. I've seen that ECSP brings together the most interesting minds and most thoughtful persons working in these fields. They bring together really a diverse community to tackle what is the pressing issue of the moment, but also the issue that we should be looking at as we look ahead. Their deep analytic strength, I think, has informed many policymakers in the last 2 decades and will continue to do, I'm sure. And their offerings, I can tell you, have given me new ideas about the issue I care about, climate change, and its relation to women's reproductive health, to environmental security, to the issue of natural resources as a defense to climate change, and population dynamics. So they have improved my thinking, and I suspect that you will learn a great deal here today as well. In short, it's my distinct honor and pleasure to say congratulations to Roger Mark and his team and the Wilson Center for this remarkable accomplishment. I'm going to spare you the happy birthday. My kids told me, do not do that, Mom. So with that, I'll say, lucky you. Unfortunately, I cannot stay for the panel, but I'm looking forward to a back brief to find out where this august group is directing us to head. So thank you so much, Roger Mark.
Thank you very much, Alice. We've benefited from our discussions in the past few months and hope that we'll continue to do so. So thank you. I'm going to hand the panel over to our colleague, Andrew Refkin, who many of you know. Andy's covered science and environmental issues for 30 years in newspapers, magazines, books, documentaries, and his New York Times blog, .earth. And Andy and I were just chatting earlier, and he kept referring back to these articles that he had written before IPCC, and it was very, very interesting to sort of hear Andy talk about his history of writing on these issues. Since 2010, he's been a senior fellow for environmental understanding at Pace University, and many of us have benefited from Andy's writing over the years. So Andy, I'd like to hand the panel over to you. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to try to keep it mostly in the form of a brisk conversation. There's a lot of people on stage, and we have a ton of ideas to explore. We'll start with a little bit of history and reflection, and then move forward to, as you heard a minute ago, the next generation, the next 20 years. And we're going to start with the person who was one of those who started everything out, P.J. Simmons, to my left, who was the founding director of the Environmental Change and Security Program. And so, with that in mind, if you could just, and you're now, well, he was just describing to me, he's the head of an institution, a corporate eco-forum, bringing together heads of big companies with several $1 trillion worth of assets who are thinking not just in greenwash ways about the environment, but actually doing stuff that matters. And so just, if you could just reflect on how this all began briefly and set the stage for where we're going to go from here.
Sure.
That'd be great.
Well, first I got to say, I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, many of whom I haven't seen in a long, long time, and it's just it's very moving. Hopefully, I won't get emotional during this, but I'm very grateful to see a lot of you, and looking forward to seeing you at the reception as well. So my name is P.J. Simmons, and I guess reflecting on 20 years ago, one of the things that just occurred to me is that there was no email. I said this to Tom at the time, but the email was just sort of getting started then. So I remember a lot of fax machines and a lot of phone calls being at the start of this. And another thing that's changed quite a bit is my eyesight in the last 20 years. But
Font size, just you keep
bigger
ratcheting
and
it up.
bigger, yeah. But it is really amazing to think that it's been 20 years, and it's really inspiring to see what's happened in the last 20 years. And I'm looking forward to talking a lot about some of those changes. But 20 years ago, and let me take you back 22 years ago, because that really was the genesis of this. I was heading off to graduate school at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Bologna, and I took with me on the plane Al Gore's book, Earth in the Balance. And I had just finished 2 years in Washington working, but before that I had finished an undergraduate term at Tufts University, graduated summa cum laude, did all these different courses in international relations, got this tremendous education in international affairs. And I don't think anybody mentioned the environment once in 4 years. And so I read Al Gore's book, and it was just like somebody took a 2x4 and smacked me in the head and said, my God, these issues of environmental change and demographic change, and what's been happening, what is happening, and what's going to happen, are going to profoundly affect everything that we care about on the human agenda, economic security and otherwise. And it just became so clear to me at that moment that I needed, as my mission at SAIS, to integrate environment into everything that I did. So that's what I set out to do. It was not easy, and I did not find a lot of experts at the time. Things have changed dramatically, obviously, today. I don't think you can go to an undergraduate education anymore without learning about climate change and learning about a lot of these things and how they impact things we care about. But that was the scenario just 22 years ago. I ended up getting an internship at the White House at the very first office of the National Security Council that was created, called the Global Environmental Affairs Directorate, that Eileen Clausen headed under the first Clinton-Gore administration. And that when I came back to Washington for my second year of grad school, that's where I worked and spent most of my days and evenings working on papers and studying for exams. And in the course of that whole time, both at SAIS and at the White House, I started learning about lots of shining individuals in the academic sphere, like Tad Homer-Dixon, one of the pioneers. Bob Kaplan wrote a very influential piece in The Atlantic at that time. Jessica Matthews, of course, had written a seminal piece in Foreign Affairs called Redefining Security in 1989. There were others, too, that were sort of contributing to this evolution and understanding. But basically, there was a lot of different people in government, outside of government, in think tanks, in academia, talking about the connections between environment, population, and security in very different ways, using different terms. There was a lot of real clear analytical thinking and a lot of sloppiness, frankly. And this term environmental security kept getting thrown around in a thousand different ways. Jeff and I have talked about this for years. And one of the reasons that we ended up calling the Environmental Change and Security Program what we did with, not calling it environmental security, is we wanted to really make this about the connections between all these issues, not just about the security of the environment, which is implied by that term. So in any case, I thought it might be helpful at the end of my time at the White House, when we were starting to see the State Department, Department of Interior, Defense Department, and many others in government starting to talk about these issues in different ways, same outside of government, a sort of safe space to bring people together to talk about these issues and their relevance to each other, and have those honest conversations. And I had luckily been part of the Wilson Center for 2 years before I went to graduate school, helping to start the Cold War International History program here. And so it was a very natural fit for me to come back to the Wilson Center and say, hey, I've got this crazy idea. And the Wilson Center back then was really forward-thinking and said, that sounds really interesting. We'd love to have you come try to make that happen. And it was really thanks to a lot of individuals, one of whom I'm sitting next to, Tom Lovejoy, who was one of the 3 advisory board members that we reached out to at the very beginning to say, hey, we'd love to, we have this big vision, what do you think? But it was also the Agency for International Development 20 years ago that some staffers there just really were captivated by the potential for all of these connections and these silos to be broken. And AID just really, took this 22-year-old and said, hey, whatever I was at the time, and 24 or something, I'm not going to reveal my age, and said, we really want to help. And they helped in a really big way. And so did the Pew Center, the Pew Foundation as well, kind of getting it all started. So, I still remember the days where we brought together, at the very, very beginning, we had this, because of the Wilson Center, had the convening power to bring together Warren Christopher and all of the Assistant Secretaries of State at the time to talk about what these things meant to them. And then Jeff DeBelco, I can't sort of finish this story without mentioning Jeff. When I was thinking about all this at the very, very beginning, I mentioned to some friends from SAIS that I was trying to get this started. And one of them said, we've got a friend who's working on his PhD on a lot of these issues. You should give him a call. And we talked for maybe 2 hours the first time we had a conversation. And Jeff really is the founding co-director of the Environmental Change and Security Program, because he was with us from the very, very beginning, intellectually and organizationally, to really make it sing. And of course, I ran the program for 3 years. Jessica Matthews made the compelling case that if I wanted to be most influential in my lifetime, I should get my foreign policy credentials outside of the label of just environment, so she recruited me to the Carnegie Endowment. And I only accepted that offer because Jeff was willing to run the program. And as you see, that was the best decision anybody's ever made. So anyway, that's the background.
That's a great initial briefing. We're going to shift to a little deeper discussion of the security context by moving to this end of the table with Sharon Burke, who is now the New America Foundation Senior Advisor on International Security, focusing on everything we're talking about, energy, climate change, resource challenges. But she had probably one of the more interesting titles that I've stumbled upon. When she was in the Obama administration in the Department of Defense, she was Assistant Secretary of Defense for Operational Energy, which I've touched on in some. Actually, we were talking about West Point a few minutes ago. I live right across the river from West Point and up the Hudson. And I was at a meeting there a couple of years ago, and there was someone who had described to me the bottom-up innovation potential within the military services, where people in hot tents, someone came up with this idea of insulating these tents, that they were air conditioning, spending a lot of joules to run air conditioners and then someone came up with a simple way to insulate them. I don't know if you even know about this particular case, but that's I assume that's what operational energy means. So could you just kind of again reflect on the Wilson Center's role here, but also just on this idea of how things can happen in the systems we are dealing with, social systems we're dealing with now?
Sure, and I can kind of track with PJ and say, so where was I 20 years ago?
Yeah.
And I was also coming out of graduate school, out of Columbia, and was arriving in Washington with a brand new advanced degree. And of course, Columbia at the time, the program I went through didn't have an international energy program, so I made one up. So I had a degree that I cobbled together in energy policy and in Middle Eastern studies, and came into the US government through the Presidential Management Fellows program. and wanted to work on energy security, but there wasn't any place to do that. Keep in mind that the price of oil at the time was pretty low. And so people, the question was, why would you care about that? So I went to work at the Department of Defense in the Middle East office, where as an Arabic speaker, I naturally ended up on the South Asia desk, but that's a long story. But so most of my career has been in and out of the Department of Defense ever since. And so I've had a chance to see how the Pentagon looks at these issues and has changed on these issues over time. And definitely, the Woodrow Wilson Center's program played a role in changing that dialogue. So, I was arriving for that first time right after the Cold War ended. And the Pentagon, we knew what we were in the Cold War, and we knew what our job was, and we knew what our focus was. We knew what we were organizing, training, and equipping for. And that's the legal responsibility of the Department of Defense, to organize, train, and equip for the defense of the country. But once that went away, and the what are you solving for became a more complicated question, the answer became more complicated. And the department's ability, and I see we have a wonderful person here formerly from the National Intelligence Council, the intelligence community, the defense community, the answer started to get more complicated. And I think there was a lot of reliance on this program to help inform those discussions. So you get to the point now where the Department of Defense's signature strategy document, the Quadrennial Defense Review, talks about demographic change and talks about environmental change, talks about energy security, talks about water and what it means for security. The National Intelligence Strategy just came out yesterday, and there's a section on natural resources in that. It does have a big section on strategic environment, but that's not what they mean. They mean something else. So, but they do have a section on natural resources. I think that the security agencies of our government understand that these issues influence security. Where it gets more interesting is then what? So they understand that it's in the overall strategic landscape, the security context, that these are all the influences that determine security in a very basic, broadest sense. Are you safe? Are you safe in your home? Are you going to pick up a weapon? Are you going to move? Are you going to destabilize a region that destabilizes us? They understand that all those questions have to be asked. It's the then what that gets more complicated. And I'm not sure that's a bad thing, because the truth is there's not always a military answer to a security challenge. And I think that's where the evolution of this program has been very interesting. And that's still a very live question. Just yesterday, I was telling my husband in the car, and he's an environmental engineer, for context, what I was coming to do today. And we just happened to hear right when I said that, a snippet of President Obama saying that Ebola was a national security threat and that we were sending military forces to deal with it. And my husband just had a really strong reaction, and he doesn't usually follow these issues that closely. And he said, that's not a national security threat. It's dangerous. It's something we have to deal with. It's something that I worry about, but it's not national security. And I said, well, it all depends on what is security? Is security getting our kids to school and food on the table, and what prevents us from doing that? And then that broader context, or are you talking about military security and defense threats that require a weapon to counter? And he kind of looked at me and I said, and that's what that event's going to be about. So this debate in some ways has gotten a lot more data rich, a lot more really truly gifted and interesting people, including all these folks at the table. Jeff has been just an absolute leader in this field. Roger Mark is leader in this field. Tom has been for a long time. The discussions got more rich, but the basic questions are the same. And I would say the Department of Defense has joined that discussion, but still the then what is, as far as how does that inform what weapons you need, or where your forces are, or what your relationships are with other countries. You have the commander of Pacific Command saying climate change is a major threat in my region, but then what? So what's his responsibility to deal with it and counter it? That's still a hard question to answer, and you still don't see that kind of throughput, and that's not all bad.
Yeah.
So.
Well, you mentioned data, which is a good transition to science, and we wanted to make sure Tom Lovejoy could talk about the integration of science, which really does it basically frames the playing field, including the uncertainties on issues that all the policy questions get hashed out under. And I first met this guy in the Amazon in 1989 when I was stumbling around trying to put together my book on the murder of Chico Mendes, which was as much about security, at least at the community level, as it was about the environmental change. And then I got to Manaus, and this guy comes out of the steaming rainforest wearing a bow tie. No, actually, just kidding. Forget the bow tie. But there was good cuisine. There was good cooking there, actually, at your camp.
We do that.
Wherever
Yeah.
Tom is, there's
Yeah,
good food.
there, he was
Good
studying. He was studying what level of fragmentation of rainforests is too much for biodiversity to be sustained. And you could look at the same issues were there in terms of societies. One of the most powerful pictures I've seen in recent years that gets across this reality is of a satellite image of the Xingu Park in the Amazon, where you see this area that's inhabited by indigenous peoples, and there's all these fires burning around the edges, and the park is green for the moment. But you go over to Peru, and just last week, 4 Indian activists were murdered by logging interests, at least as far as we know. So security is implicit, and this insecurity is implicit in this question of how much stuff do we maintain as a natural resource. So can you, I mean, obviously with your long history here, you have some stuff to say about this organization. Well, but I mean, you've just kind of lived in the middle of areas where you've got this natural integration of the security and environment questions. Maybe just tell a little bit about that.
So actually, let me just pick up on what happened in Peru. So Bruce Babbitt and I have an op-ed, I think in today's Folha de São Paulo, basically lauding Brazil for how they responded to the murder of Chico Mendes, creating extractive reserves and da-da-da-da, and suggesting that this is the way forward for Peru after this unfortunate incident. So my office was on the 3rd floor of the castle, and the Environmental Change and Security Program office, newly opened, was on the 4th floor. And Charles Blitzer, then the head of the Woodrow Wilson Center, sent PJ down to recruit me to be part of an advisory group. You know, and how could I say no? I mean, it really resonated. But it was a long time ago, and my first email exchange was with PJ, right? From the 3rd floor to the 4th floor, and the answer came back, "Isn't email fun?"
Used to be.
So, you know, I think the most interesting thing I learned in that entire 20 years was when I decided I was going to write a piece about biological diversity and security. So I labored away at this and sent it to PJ, and it came back, and he basically said, "You need to rewrite this completely so that a political scientist would recognize it as an essay around security." And so, disappointed as I was, I did that, and it was a really important lesson, because basically I learned if you really want to talk to somebody, it's much better to learn their language than try and teach them yours. And so that was a really important thing that I got out of being part of this overall exercise. So I think over the 20-year period, there are not very many new issues, but our understanding of them and their urgency and their scale and their complexity has certainly changed a lot. And sort of the time frame in which we have the chance to really make a difference is now, I think, quite clearly very short. And yet in the end, we're only going to get ahead in the right kinds of directions if we think about those sort of political science, social aspects, sort of issues of population and everything else, which this project has contributed so well to over the years. So I think that's probably enough for now.
That's a good enough. There'll be more. We're going to make the rounds here. And now we have to talk about health, obviously, especially with Ebola simmering in Africa and so many other issues to think about there in terms of how we invest, how much we focus on root causes as opposed to consequences when it comes to health. Again, the indications are that Ebola emerges from areas where you have bats and or other animals that are harboring sort of a reservoir. But too often our focus is just on the outbreak and not getting back to the root. So, sorry, my notes are all over the place here. Okay, we were just talking earlier. Carmen, who's Senior Public Health Advisor at USAID, the Office of Population and Reproductive Health. Do you have a sense of how what's been happening here for 20 years and just more generally has evolved in terms of trying to get the balance right on root causes versus being prepared for health consequences of issues that arise that we face so many of these days?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Andy. Yeah. I have to say it's truly a pleasure on behalf of the Office of Population and Reproductive Health to be here today and celebrating the 20th anniversary of ECSP. It's also an honor to be here with those that had the vision to start it and with those of you who've continued to make sure that vision has been implemented. So in the past few days, I've had the pleasure of speaking with the former directors of our office, current and former directors of our office who've been with ECSP from the beginning, and asked them sort of how do you think our office and our agency has benefited from the work that ECP has done over the years. And it's not a surprise, it's been said here before. The answer was quite clear. Putting into the limelight the issues that our office cares about, the issues of population dynamics and gender, and making the clear link of these issues to environment and security. And so often we see that these issues are seen as women's issues or health issues. And ECSP has successfully made the case that issues of population dynamics, issues of population dynamics, family planning, women's empowerment, and gender are really critical to the environment and to security. And they've done this across policy audiences. So they've done this with the military, with our intelligence officers, as well as our foreign policy leaders and thought leaders. And so we're grateful for that. I know Roger Mark didn't want a celebratory event, but it's hard to be here and not to say and not to highlight the role that really ECSP has done for the issues that our office care about. But it's not only the research that we think has been important. We value the work that ECSP has done featuring programmatically, sort of what happens at the end in our communities when issues of population, health, and environment are addressed in an integrated way. And I think many of us know that our office has a soft earmark that was started in 2002 that really asks us to program population family planning funding in areas where population growth sort of threatens biodiversities and endangered species. And we've learned through programming over the years of our population health and environment programs that when we look at these issues in integrated ways, when we bring family planning to communities that live in areas where biodiversity is threatened, overall we see improved health outcomes, and we see that we're building more resilient communities. And I think this is important because as of, I guess, over the past year, there's been growing attention to these issues of resiliency, and it comes into play when we're looking at what's going on in West Africa now. Our agency, and we were talking over lunch about the various definitions that exist out there, and when it comes to discussions on resiliency. And USAID sort of defines it as the community's or nation's ability to mitigate, adapt to, and recover from shocks, and sort of reduce this idea of chronic vulnerability. And what we've seen, USAID is started in February an initiative called RISE, which is really Resilience in the Sahel Enhanced Initiative. And as we all know, the Sahel is an area of the world that suffers from chronic poverty, food insecurity, drought, and violent extreme. It's where violent extremism sort of collides with all of these issues. And so it's interesting to look at the lessons learned from the population health environment programs, which the Woodrow Wilson Center ECSP program has really helped to disseminate and synthesize and apply them to resilience. And when we look forward, this is an area of work that I know Roger Mark has been leading recently, is really trying to make sure that as we move forward with this new buzzword of resiliency and trying to program to ensure resilience communities, that we apply the lessons learned from our population health and environment programs in the past. And so when it comes to working across all sectors of the government, and it comes to areas of the Sahel where we know it's going to take a whole of government response, we look back 20 years at what ECSP was pioneering, and we see that it's ever more relevant today, and that we need the lessons learned and the research and the forum to bring all of the academics and the policymakers and the practitioners together to discuss how we're facing this challenge. And for another example that Sharon brought up, I was fortunate enough recently to participate in a simulation exercise with our DoD colleagues as well as State Department colleagues and other practitioners in the field, really looking at what are the multi-sectoral approaches to building resilience in the Sahel. And I have to say, I was shocked that our DoD colleagues were the ones standing up and saying, unless you address rates of early marriage in the Sahel, unless you address rates of gender, you're never going to build, and the high fertility rates, you're never going to build resilient communities. And for me, even though it was stated as a simulation exercise, it was hopeful in terms of maybe we can take that discussion to the next level. We recognize it's a problem. It was helpful for me to hear that across government, we're recognizing issues of fertility and gender are important to the environment and to national security. Let's work on solutions and getting the programmings in place in order to minimize the impact in the future. So on that, I think that as we are looking at crisis in West Africa today, and we recognize that we need sort of this whole of government approach to intervene immediately in terms of to slow down the spread of Ebola, I think it is a wake-up call in terms of looking long-term and building our systems so that we're able to forecast when public health crises are going to have a negative impact and spiral out of control. But it's also an issue of governance, and that's first and foremost an issue of governance where governance intersects health. And I think more discussions that we can have that really start in the planning phase to implement programs that break down the silos in the field can help prevent and mitigate these disasters in the future.
Great. I'd love to hear more from Sharon on that at some soon. These discussions that go across government into the security apparatus. But Jeff, communication is something we got to talk about. And
Funny you bringing that topic up.
Yeah. You know, I'm convinced, of course, how could I not be, that communication innovation is it maybe not as important as energy innovation, but the ability to share and shape ideas has never been greater. And the Wilson Center very early on proved to be very adaptable. And new security beat, getting into the blogosphere, having a presence on Twitter. You jumped on this early, and maybe you could chart a little bit of that for the audience, the importance of shifting from just putting out a white paper and then waiting for a press release and waiting for someone like me to call.
Right. Yes, no, indeed. Kind of a faith-based approach.
Right. That's right.
Well, thank you, Andy. And I echo what all the friends up here say about how terrific it is to see so many friends here in the audience, and I know online. Speaking of communication innovations, the fact that the Wilson Center invests and is smart enough to make these sessions ones that our colleagues outside the Beltway can benefit indirectly. So welcome to those watching online. I think a couple things were key to this evolution that did really change and tried to be forward-leaning and in some ways, use all the tools in the toolbox rather than relying on one or relying on the old ones. One was, and this was a learning process for me and for everyone who comes to the Wilson Center, is the fact that by being a nonpartisan, non-advocacy forum in a town that is anything but that, or everything but that, that's a real advantage. And we had a lot of folks who we engaged with, particularly early on, who just assumed that that was kind of playing in the Washington game with one hand tied behind your back, when in fact I think it was they who had to make a case, whether that was an NGO advocacy case or private sector case or the government representing the government's position, that it was actually they who had the hand tied behind. And we were free to talk with all sorts of hands or whatever, all the different parties who needed to come to the table. And that gave us a real advantage in creating that safe space, a term that somebody's used already, to allow people to feel comfortable talking to those whom they hadn't, and on topics that they just couldn't imagine they had anything to do with. And that is not easy. It's not that people are necessarily clamoring to do that. But that environment turned out to actually be a real advantage. The other was leadership. So when Congressman Hamilton came down from the Hill and directed this, and Mike Van Duzen and the team came along, literally in our first meeting with Lee said, we're not going to define success at the Wilson Center by how many times you get your name in the newspaper. We're not going to be that Washington. At the same time, it was go forth and do interesting things, and we'll give you flexibility too, if that's what serves the purpose of sharing this with different audiences. That's one mechanism. And I think part of the reason that we have been as successful as we are, we had people on the team, immediate and within the center itself, who saw the interaction with the media and journalism as a critical partner, a partner in the sense to learn from, rather than just try to cynically get your stuff placed with, right? That they were about telling stories and communication technologies, and they were going to be early adopters of these things. So if Andy Revkin was on Twitter, by God, we had to be on Twitter too, right? So in that sense, part of it is also the analog of don't trust anyone over 30 was trust all the young people on the communication side. So part of it was all of us listening to the folks who were being quite innovative and leading that. And so, Megan Parker and Skylar Knoll and Sean Peoples, a lot of people who are still here, as well as folks who've been here previously, were really our innovators in so many respects. And so whether it was PJ kind of having to find an extra computer to run a server so we could actually have a website back in the day, or to now making the argument within the center, it's not a website or a blog or Facebook or Twitter, it's all of it, right? And finding ways to do that and understand and be able to defend in those settings where you did have skeptical audiences for these different means. It was the weight of the paper was the strength of the argument, right? In terms of how heavy the big book was the best, right? Now in academia, I still see that plenty of times, right? The thickest book wins. To understand that it wasn't that 140 characters was superficial, it was, can you get their attention in 140 characters? And it's a teaser to take them to then the blog post, and gosh, that's interesting, in 800 words, I want to see the report. I want to see the analysis. I want to come to the center and engage on this topic. And so it was that integrated strategy that required those different platforms on the communication also to match this notion that how do you get people working on everything as diverse as population, family planning, development, health, natural resources, and climate, and environment and climate, those are two different worlds too, right? We don't want to forget that, as well as security in its various manifestations. And so just to close, I think it is, I'm a big fan of the kitchen sink approach, and Megan and I have gotten in fights over this all many, many years, but she, she's for kind of clarity and parsimony, and I'm for, if they tell me in their office that their boss will only let them come if they see their name of their topic in the title of the talk, then somehow we can have the nice, neat catchphrase, but the subtitle has to be the kitchen sink. And so I think that kitchen sink approach has served us well, because then we get some of those folks in the room and they might actually learn something about folks other than themselves and topics other than their focus areas.
So we're going to move to the future, and then we're going to have just a nice brisk discussion about aspects of this. And Roger, you represent the future here. And so what could you say about looking ahead using a scenario-based or predictive-based approach? What do you see a panel like this discussing 20 years from now?
Thanks very much, Andy and Jeff. Thanks to the kitchen sink.
Mm-hmm.
And Sharon, I would love to be I would love to hear these discussions between you and your husband about how you define security. It sounds fascinating.
We talk about other things
Yes.
too.
But, thinking ahead to 20 years, I also think back 20 years ago when I was working on President Clinton's President's Council on Sustainable Development, when we grappled with these issues. And there were 3 issues for the PCSD that were the most contentious issues. The first was, how do you define economic growth? The second is, what do we do about the responsibility of the United States to engage internationally? And the third was, what the heck do you do with this population issue? And I fast forward to today, and I reflect on the 20 years and the movement that has brought population to the center of natural resource management, environmental security issues, and the leaders that we have in this room right now, folks like Bob Engelman, folks like Liz Leahy-Madsen, folks like Rich Sin-Carter, who have really examined the centrality of population dynamics, age structure, reproductive health, women's empowerment, to overall development priorities. And we have really progressed as a field, not just in terms of our analytical lens and thinking of different scenarios, but in terms of very concrete policy prescriptions that the PCSD struggled with 20 years ago, and with very concrete programmatic interventions that Carmen is talking about. So today, we know what works. We know what cost-effective investments are that produce a return on investment in a short period of time, and that informs where we go forward. And I think we only have to look at reports coming out of the IPCC. You look at the 5th assessment report, and they talk about climate resilient pathways and the way that we need to move forward. And this is informing our thinking about where we need to be. So I would imagine a panel 20 years from now here at the Wilson Center talking about how we have increased our resilience by focusing on these climate resilient pathways through using transformative interventions like family planning, like peace building as an important tool for overall development priorities, like ways that we can bridge the gap between development interventions and humanitarian assistance. So I imagine that it's a question of those pathways that is framed in a resiliency framework that is transformative, that is dynamic, that is anticipatory, and that is making a difference in people's lives today, but for the lives of my sons also, and my grandchildren to come, not too soon. But you know, that we have very concrete and specific ways about how we can make a difference now. This is not an academic exercise. This is a critical intervention that we must find the concrete ways that we can make a difference now and to set the basis for the future.
Great. I'm going to open this up to all of you, the next question, which is, thinking ahead 20 years, is there some sector or focal issue that you see not represented here that will be represented 20 years from now? Aging, well, demographics is as separate from population. In other words, is that something we're going to be thinking about more than, I don't want to say just population growth, but population dynamics in many ways. Urbanization, obviously.
Yes.
And to me, communication has all these security implications, upside and downside. Think about how ISIS has utilized YouTube to recruit people, just even as we're using communication technologies to make the world a better place. They make it asymmetrically powerful path for people who may not be progressive to have a lot of influence. So what's missing here, thinking ahead? Anything you can think of? We got it covered?
No, one of the things I wonder about as we're talking too is, the influence of the United States in the international system. It's a given, and it's not necessarily something that the rest of the world loves to talk about. But one of the things that really worries me that that's not represented here among us is the sort of brittleness of our political system at the moment. And we've proven to be a very resilient country ourselves politically over hundreds of years, but we seem to be at an unusual juncture. And the truth is that for the kinds of trends and influences and needs that we're talking about, how do you deal with these systemic level influences where it's gender and demographics and resources and military security all coming together? If you have this brittle sort of inflexible and rigid political system that's not adapting and not moving, where does that leave us? And we don't have someone representing the political voice here, and if we did, they probably wouldn't be able to say what they really think, But that's definitely something that I worry about, just as far as both for the future of our country, but also of the United States' role in the world, which I know it hasn't. That lots of other people would say it isn't always a constructive role, but at bottom it really is much of the time, and certainly, there's a lot to be said for that. Are we going to be able to continue to play that role going forward, and are we going to be able to marshal what we need to at home?
So PJ, I want to ask you about corporations, which you're deeply involved with now. And Naomi Klein has a book coming out right now. It's that basically says capitalism is the problem, and that's climate change is all the fault of our capitalist system. It has to go away. So what does that feel like in terms of the next 20 years? Is that argument going to be catching fire, or is it unrealistic?
I think it's a bit of a red herring. I'm reminded, actually, when we talk about the stuff, of something Jessica Matthews said that really struck me. I saw her on a panel maybe not 20 years ago, but maybe 18 years ago or something. It was at Georgetown. You may have been there with me, but she was on a great panel talking about climate change, and she said, she had just come out of helping to co-found the World Resources Institute. I think just recently had gotten the job at the Carnegie Endowment for National Peace as president, or maybe it was right before. But anyway, she was talking about climate change, and she said, the science, what we know about the science on climate change is here, and the economics are here, and the politics are here. And flash forward to today, I think the science is even higher. The economics and the understanding of the economics of all this are higher, as is the level of engagement and understanding of business, massive, leaving policy in the dust. And the politics have gone even further downhill. And I think, what's interesting, I think in 20 years, it's not necessarily the new issues that will be on the table, it's the intersection of the issues that will be better understood by more people. And I don't know whether the United States will be leading the discussion in 20 years. At this rate, because the politics are down here both at the domestic level and in terms of international discussions. And I think what's really interesting is you see all these, increasingly, CEOs, Paul Pullman from Unilever. If you haven't heard him speak on these issues, just Google Paul and watch something or find something he's written recently. David Crane from Energy made some really provocative statements recently. This is real leadership coming from people that actually have a lot of stake in the status quo and a lot of quarterly mentality, have every excuse in the book to be focused on short term, as do a lot of political leaders that have short political cycles. But yet these guys are looking from a longer term perspective, which is really what this is all about. It's about thinking about our security and what threatens what we care about on a different time frame, and being a little bit more thoughtful about what are the things that are going to impact that and how are we going to respond to that, because it's clear that guns aren't going to solve the problem for a lot of those threats. We need to address them in all sorts of different ways, soft power and so forth. Same thing for businesses. So I think as we look forward to the years ahead, even looking as close up to the Paris negotiations next year for the next conference of the parties on climate change, I predict and I know firsthand that there will be an awful lot of new kinds of business leadership expressed at that meeting that don't just express themselves in side meetings of business that are trying to inform the negotiations, but actually brokering of agreements among smaller countries, among companies, public-private partnerships that actually could be significantly, so significant that they actually are more meaningful than some of the things that governments could agree to together. So I'm very excited about that potential. It's one of the reasons that 7 years ago I actually decided to throw a lot of my effort into, my energy into trying to work with the private sector, because you just sort of see the ability, the agility of companies to be able to actually address this stuff, and a lot of them taking it really quite seriously. That said, I think going back to Naomi Klein's point about capitalism without frameworks, without leadership, without elected officials providing a framework for them to do the right thing and make the right thing in the context of longer term societal interests, which is ultimately the responsibility of governments, not of companies. Without those parameters that are done in a smart way, like we've seen done repeatedly, like on acid rain in this country, where we did the sulfur trading regime and so forth, that didn't mandate specific solutions, but actually set a framework. And same thing with Montreal Protocol, phasing out ozone depleting substances. We've seen governments sort of set the stage and then allow companies the lead time to innovate and do what they do best without, saying overnight you have to do X, Y, and Z. And we've seen it work time and time again from an economic standpoint, from a solution standpoint. So, if we don't see governments start stepping up and doing more of that, these isolated examples of Paul Pullman and David Crane and others, they're only going to get us so far. So it's got to be together, but I'm hoping that the business leaders provide a lot of the cover for the political leaders to start finally, talking with each other, making some sense.
And so I think actually you need a redefinition of the corporation, which is what Paul Pullman and others are actually doing with their individual actions. I think it's really important that we somehow sort out the grain from the chaff in media, because there's just so much bogus information out there these days.
Not you though, Andy.
And thirdly, I think we need to get anonymous money out of the political system. It's just plain corrupt. And then, having done that, maybe we can do the things we need to do, which is have integrated planning and integrated management. Maybe not to perfection, but to a much greater degree than we have it today.
So one thing I wanted to broach was the notion of, there was a mention of the climate treaty. Tim Wirth and Tom Daschle had this really important essay that I'll tell you something that I learned the other day that was initially submitted to the New York Times as an op-ed and was rejected. I shouldn't be saying this. But it ran in the Yale Environment 360 magazine, and it was about a way to re-engage the treaty process away from the old binding emissions and model that seems so broken. And it was more about just making the treaty process more of a flexible place for nations to come forward with their best practices, and but not with that sort of old architecture that. So I didn't know if you wanted to talk about that. In 20 years, are we going to be at COP 45 or whatever it is in Dubai or wherever, and still hashing out how to come to terms with something left over from the 1992 Framework Convention, or are we going to have something different? Anyone want to jump in on that?
It may be a stretch on that, although I think it's the same point. I wanted to expand on Sharon's point about the institutions and say that while it's really tempting, given we're sitting in Washington, to focus right here, I think the challenge of how to deal with complexity, and we're getting better at describing the interconnections and understanding how these things are all linked, and we're still not very good at addressing them in this integrated fashion, even though we see some of these sources of innovation and some inspiration for doing it. I think we will, in 20 years, be talking about either how we succeeded or failed to address this in a systematic and integrated fashion. And I think I say it's more than just the federal government or one end of Pennsylvania Avenue, because we're, for reasons that are eminently understandable, we're so fascinated with focus and narrow and reward the kind of in-depth understanding and work towards a problem that's defined in one box. And so we fund things that way, we study them in our different disciplines that way, we organize our government and our NGO and our companies in those different boxes. But if this the discussions of this program have shown us anything, it's that you have to work across them. And so we had one of the more interesting discussions in a long time that came actually from AID, where some folks who are doing biodiversity work in Southeast Asia kind of came and said, we are doing this, we think we have a handle on our topic, but what we know is there's a whole bunch in the periphery that we don't know. And we don't have the time or the expertise to figure it out, and we need help with you pulling in folks from environment and demographics and economics and conflict to help us understand what our threats and opportunities and how we can be focused with money that will get our hands slapped if we spend it on anything other than biodiversity, but let's at least know what is out in the wings that has importance for us. And so we got to get a lot smarter, not just on the politics, but on how we address these things. I would say a lot more flexible and understand that we can have, well, we can spend a lot of money, for example, on HIV drugs, but if the people are dying from dirty water because you can't spend any of that money on basic sanitation and health issues, then that's pretty stupid, right? And it's not going to get you very far. We've seen some of that learning happen and some of that become more flexible, but there, as we know, still ways that we could get a lot better at that. And I think that's going to be a critical institutional challenge for moving forward.
As a residential scientist on the panel, I wanted to ask you about the science community and academia more generally, so this might involve others. I had this interesting email conversation with Dan Kamen, who's an amazing energy researcher at Berkeley. He was at the World Bank for a while too. And he reminded me of these papers he had written in the 90s about what he called the need for mundane science. That the whole community and academia, anyone who wants to advance as a scientist, you have to be on the leading edge. But what he was saying was, a cleaner cook stove, if that's a priority for reducing public health disaster in developing countries, then how do we integrate, how do we push more of our enterprise, our young, brilliant minds in those areas? And it was really, so Google for mundane science, and you'll find a really interesting question, which I think relates to other arenas as well, where we're always about the leading edge and the next technology and not about doing the stuff that could really accelerate progress in the poorest parts of the world. Do you get a sense, is there a way to shift, to build some of that in to how we make our decisions in our careers or when we teach our students? Or
So I think the short answer is yes. There are always the challenges of the way universities are set up with sort of stovepipes of disciplines. And even at George Mason, where my job description is just keep doing what you're doing, do light teaching and help us build environment and science, I still get evaluated annually as if I were a standard academic, right? Well, happily, I've got this research machine in the Amazon that puts out all these papers every year, so I just stick that in and it's fine, right? But I think universities everywhere are struggling with ways to address that constraint. And so, this is not an advertisement for Mason, but we're going to create an Institute for Sustainable Earth. And the impetus for that came from a series of professors, Ed Maybach, who does the public opinion research on climate change attitudes, and Shukla, who's a great climate guy, and et cetera. And basically we got together and all of a sudden we're talking about, we just really want to make a difference. We're not interested in being our standard academics anymore. And happily we have a 46-year-old or 47-year-old president, the age of my children, who is a great believer in sustainability. And so out of this has come this notion of creating an Institute for a Sustainable Earth. I cannot tell you a thing about how it will be run or designed, except that I'm chairing the search committee. But anyway, I think there are a bunch of universities, initiatives like this starting up all over the place that are trying to basically address the straitjacket of traditional academia and come up with some real insights and solutions for the future.
And just on that note,
Yeah.
if I could add in sort of how I would see us having this discussion 20 years from now, I do think that we have resources on the continent of sub-Saharan Africa of innovation, and I think President Obama's initiative, the YALI initiative, that really taps into the young African leaders and their ideas for how to solve their local problems. I think there is a future in that, and I would hope that 20 years from now, the conversation would be like this investment in the continent's future, and definitely yielding that ideas are coming from the ideas that are coming from the countries themselves, and how they can feed into your institute on the sustainable earth. I think I see, and I would hope that the programming innovations from now on are coming more and more from the countries in which we're trying to help, and we're trying to move forward and sort of so we can create the sustainable earth, because it's going to take all of us from all parts of the globe in order to reach the goals that we want to make, and to curb some of these issues of climate change, and to really address these issues of population dynamics and gender inequity. And I'm hopeful that 20 years from now that the conversation that we're having will include sort of more voices from the continent sharing how they're innovated, how the solutions they've come up with have tried to solve and address some of these issues.
So I think we're about ready to move to questions from the audience. I assume we have either, I'll repeat the questions, or
We got microphones.
there are microphones
Yeah, yes,
roving.
we have
And I'm not sure if
colleagues who are
anything's
coming.
coming in from the internet, but if there are, just feed them this way. So any burning questions out there right away? Right here in the front. Say who you are and ask your brief question.
I'm Jerry Gladden with the Millennium Project. 20 years from now, it seems to me we might be talking about things like international protocols and agreements on how to regulate, manage artificial intelligence, anonymously creating its own software to run environmental security. We might also be talking 20 years from now about the citizenship of environmental refugees with no countries and no precedents before. We also may be talking about mass migrations moving from Africa to Europe. 20 years from now, we might be talking about how do we prevent a single individual from using synthetic biology in their basement to make weapons of mass destruction.
That's a good list. Yeah. You remind me of Brad Allenby at Arizona State has this way of taking your head in any conversation you have with him and making it go in 360 degrees, like that horror movie. So thinking about the unknown unknowns and the sort of knowable unknowns are really important. Do any of those resonate in a way that what makes you, well, Sharon, you got to say something.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing about working in the Department of Defense, because it's a massive agency that has a $700 billion budget, and 200, give or take, of that is focused on fighting wars right now. A lot of refugees right now, right? And we have a great deal of difficulty. They're not environmental refugees, depending on how you look at Syria, but we don't know how to deal with that right now, where we can define them absolutely as refugees. Even when they meet the legal definition, we don't know how to deal with it. So DoD is this massive agency with this big footprint, and can get things done. And we work on an interesting set of timelines, because we work on right now, and it's all consuming. How do you deal with ISIS? How do you deal with Ebola? How do you use military assets to carry out the wishes of political leadership in the country? And that's very consuming. But at the same time, and then we have a 1-year budget cycle, sort of. It's not really working right now, but we also have a 5-year plan for that budget. We have to explain what we're going to do with that money over 5 years. And then we have a 40-year time horizon, basically, because that's how long it takes. In 20, 40 years, that's how long it takes to build a weapons system and to design a military force and make sure that you have the people you need. So that's why you get things like this scenario exercise, this war game, where you get military planners trying to think in those terms about where might we be 20 years from now or 40 years from now, where you have the democratization of highly destructive weapons, and the increasing autonomous nature of weapons systems. What's that going to look like, and what do we need to live in that world? Because if we don't start building it now, we won't have it. So it is very much the way the department works, and that is why we play those games. But it's still hard sometimes to connect that strategic vision with the means and how you get there, particularly when you're talking about complexity, because DoD still doesn't have a great way to manage that complexity either. And it's funny, I had a conversation with a senior former DoD leader at one point where he was telling me that energy wasn't really a security issue. And I can tell you ways that there are. You said the tent liners, for example, and you know, if you're in a combat outpost in Afghanistan and people are dying bringing you fuel, needing less fuel has a very strong military return, right? So that energy security in that sense is. But then he said, you might as well say poverty is the security problem because that's causing all the instability we have to fight. And it's not a military responsibility to deal with poverty. And I don't disagree with that, but on the other hand, right when we were having that conversation, there were provincial reconstruction teams in Afghanistan and Iraq that had military members that were trying to deal with poverty in order to stabilize the situation. So we deal with these things, you know, we say it's not a military role, but sometimes it is. And figuring out what these challenges look like 20 years down the line is something that we're spending money on right now, today. So it's an interesting set of timelines.
Good, you?
Well, thank you. I'm Alan Hecht with the EPA.
It is.
And I want to first congratulate the Wilson Center and all of you for
Do the musician thing, kind of eat the mic.
with the great work that you've done. And I've worked with many of you over the last decade, so congratulations to you. I think the subject of anticipating, responding to future issues is crucial. And a little discussion to follow up to what we've just said. As I look at this, and I'd be interested in your reaction, it seems to me that in looking at environment, security, and the consequences, we need to look at the major mega trends that are out there right now and be able to respond to them. And unfortunately, we're not easy to do that. And I'm thinking enormous population growth, the expanded urban development. In fact, the Chinese are moving millions of people into cities. And in terms of the upcoming climate negotiations, they have said sustainability is successful only in cities. Economic development around the world and its use of water, energy, materials, and its subsequent impact on the environment. And as a consequence of that, the growth of disadvantaged communities, the social inequities, which is going to create the kind of issues that we're seeing about in a very disturbing way. When you put all those together, you have climate change, you have climate impact, which has been out there for debated for 30 years, and we're finally responding to it. So the question really is, if we're going to meet 20 years from now, how are we able to deal with these issues in a more effective way that brings government together, business-government collaboration together? How can we build a resilient, adaptive society? And how does the general public really fully understand what we're talking about here so they can be more supportive of the impacts of work of EPA, Defense Department, or anyone else on areas that are very much important to connect the dots?
One thing that keeps popping in my mind, has for the last 20 years and does a lot during this conversation, is just the topic of framing and how we communicate these issues. And I think that's kind of at the heart of at least my interpretation of the answer. I think we will be at a better place and more successful when, and also the messengers that are delivering the messages here. So, for example, my fantasy in business, the business context, today you have a lot of vice presidents for sustainability or chief sustainability officers. I'm hoping that in a relatively short time, that function will no longer exist, and that will actually be the chief strategy officer of the company. And that chief strategy officer will have to inherently understand the connections between all of these longer term issues that are going to affect the cost structure of the company, the risk structure, the potential for revenues, new opportunities, the brand, protecting all of that stuff, the license to operate, all those things. And similarly in policy and government and the Defense Department, you know, of course, when you're talking to a military planner and somebody from the DoD about these issues, they're going to be thinking about the role of the military and defining, you know, answering that question of, is it a security issue from that standpoint? But to a person at policy planning or to the President of the United States, or somebody that's thinking about the balance of assets and how, and the structure of our foreign policy and how much we invest in soft power and how much we invest in other tools that will affect those underlying dynamics, That's where the conversations, really need to be had. So
Do you think there's public will for that, though? Because I mean, that is realistically, that's unfortunately part of the American character, right? We'll put our money into military. We won't put it into the State Department and AID. Carmen does not get what she should have.
well, again, I think part of agreed. Part of I think our challenge for all of us is to continue to speak about these issues, not just in terms of risks and problems, but also in terms of opportunities. And I would have loved to see the Obama administration way back when talking about an energy future and about all of the positive things that could come from a different course, steering the big tanker in a different direction in the context of global competitiveness, in the context of the recession and the collapse of the economy. I would have loved to see that be the conversation and the enticement of, look what we could do, as opposed to, framing it in terms of the risks of climate change and so forth. So to me, that's part of the answer, at least, is the framing and how things are organized.
You know what else? Maybe someone else, a missing voice in a way, is when you were saying that, and I was thinking, who does that? Who brings? And not to like that the entire world that you all need to think about in my terms is in my car on the way to take the kids to school, but the kids play an app where they spread a virus around the world. Have you seen this one?
Oh, God.
They manage an epidemic and a pandemic. And I realize that's like, I would like it if it were the other way around, and I did make a teaching moment out of this the other day with Ebola. Like, wouldn't you like to know how to stop that instead of how to spread it? But it is raising it's a game they're obsessed with, and all their friends are obsessed with it. It is raising their awareness about the role of these megatrends and how something spreads, and particularly how, because they were like, well, it spreads a lot faster in, I won't name names, this country because they have a really bad government, right? And these, kids 10. And so they've figured out through this app where a virus is more likely to spread faster. So Hollywood, entertainment, a movie like World War Z, it's not really about zombies. It's about megatrends and the way things spread. The role that has in helping people understand the way the world's changing, I think, is really important. You can't underestimate it.
I could add a couple points to Sharon's point, which I agree with fully. I think, most recently I've been involved with some of the university and college administrations and faculty who are looking at how do you internationalize campuses. And this has to do with curriculum. It has to do with study abroad, which is not just going to Paris because you can drink wine easily.
That's why I went.
which we know.
Although that's perfectly fine.
That's perfectly fine too. But how do you bring this to U.S. campuses in a way that's real and meaningful, and at the same time recognizing that within the U.S. and within our campuses, we have a lot of the political elite from developing countries who are coming here for tertiary education. So the discussion that we were having within university administrations is, how do we capitalize on this? What does this mean for educational opportunities? How are we creating a new generation that gets these connections, both in terms of Americans, but those who are going abroad to lead their countries? I sit on the advisory board, on an advisory board for the National Science Foundation, and we are looking specifically at how we can bridge the gap between social science and natural sciences. And one of the issues that comes up all the time is, how do you get more Americans, into the engineering fields? And why are they moving out? Why are our students moving out of these fields? And part of the response is they don't feel engaged. They don't feel that this is meaningful work that is connected to making a difference in the world today. And we see this, Carmen and I see this all the time in our international work. When we go out to these communities overseas where we see real changes happening, how are we involving citizens, citizen engagement, citizen science, change that's happening at that local scale, and how do you move that up is very important. I think it's a very important mobilizing force and has a very important role to play. And that is something that I think we will be looking at 20 years from now. And comment to go back to your point about Africans and African educational systems. You know, a lot of the discussions we have been having on this issue around the demographic dividend, 20 years from now, it's going to be too late. We need to help people on the continent no longer be graduating into unemployment. So how are we providing those career and educational tracks so that they come out with the credentials and expertise that allow for meaningful employment that make a difference today? So these are some of the things that I think, I hope we'll be talking about the success stories 20 years from now, because that window is the next 20 years.
I'm going to throw in a couple of little tidbits that relate to this. And the innovation that is happening at George Mason is happening elsewhere. It's great to see. There's a website called Stop Disasters. Ooh, I just had it. StopDisastersGame.org. It's UNISDR, the UN.
I'll give him that instead.
StopDisastersGame.org. It's kind of crude. It's a crude online game. It really is. It's a prototype, I think, for what can happen educationally, where you are the mayor of a coastal village and it's a place that looks kind of like Indonesia, and there's a tsunami, and you can invest a certain amount of money in changing your community. You can plant mangroves, you can move houses, and then here comes the wave, and you can see how you did, you know, the cost-benefit analysis. And there's so many opportunities along those lines. This is just like a prototype that if we think afresh at different levels of education, how to build that in, there's great potential. At Pace University is where I teach now, is a modest school. It has a high number of ethnic and social diversity. We created a course a few years back where instead of going on their spring break to drink margaritas on a beach, the students in my communication program, we go and make a film about something. And all the films in the last 4 years and next year are about sustainable resource management issues. Baja sea turtle conservation in a poor community, shrimp farming in Belize using low impact techniques. And these are kids who are not environmental studies majors. They're kids who are going to go out into the corporate world, but they get a taste for what this amorphous thing called sustainability is like, and they get to go to a place that's novel, and it's really exciting to see what's possible. But it takes some flexibility on the parts of the people who run schools to say we need to do more of that, and that's what's hard. Are there other questions out there? Anyone in the back? Oh, now all of a sudden there's like a bunch of questions. How about way in the back there, the woman with the dark hair and the glasses? It looks like my sister.
Thanks to each of you, both for your innovation 20 years ago and for continuing that during the last 20 years and expanding. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on not just the next 20 years, but more on now. So each of you talked a little bit about that, some in the realm of academics, maybe a little bit more about, given our political climate, what the average citizen can do to influence change, and how we can really leverage things today and not just 20 years from now, because as Roger Mark was saying, 20 years from now is going to be too late. And even in today's generation, my generation in this country, we're graduating with high unemployment rates. So what can we do here today to leverage the average citizen, young or older, to really create a climate that will lead to improvement and sustainable development? And
Great
thank you again.
Jeff has volunteered.
I did. In fact, I tell them they need to be like Tom Lovejoy. I literally say this. I say the reason Tom is really effective in Washington is he is a strong natural scientist who can speak the language of politics and social sciences and everything. So he is conversant across different languages. And so running now an environmental studies program where I have students coming in from all these different angles, I really try to say, yes, I know you want to know everything you possibly can about the technical side of dealing with acid mine drainage and water quality in watersheds. But you know, it's out of your comfort zone, but that environmental economics class, you just got to take it. And that GIS, you also have to do that. And you know, it gets to be a long list and it's challenging in part. They can't do it all in their graduate degree, but they can adopt the mode and the mindset that they are going to be most effective in doing what they want to do if they can speak these different languages. And Tom's alluded to that already, but I think he's a perfect illustration of how people can be particularly effective if they have that fluency and frankly credibility in those different worlds and really make a difference.
So the one course I do teach in the spring at George Mason is basically about solving problems, right? And it's great. So the students each get to pick some kind of problem they're going to produce a solution for. I give them things I'm working on. So I think, for any individual, if they can just get interested in a particular problem and then start trying to figure out how to make a difference, they will soon find lots of ways to make a difference.
This reminds me of a really empowering concept that John Foley, who was at the University of Minnesota until recently, and he just became the head of the California Academy of Sciences maybe a month ago or so, has been talking a lot about the last couple of years, which is the idea of planetary levers. And it reminds me of when 20 years ago, Paul Rise and Fall of Great Powers, Kennedy wrote a book on pivotal states. But there's all these issues, there's all this complexity, it's totally overwhelming. It is so helpful as human beings to kind of get an organizing framework that says, actually, for the things I care about, there are these steps and there are these things that really would make a difference if we pulled these levers. And he's done that on a lot of natural resource environmental related issues. There's lots of that out there, some really good bipartisan studies and exhaustive things that have been done that point to roadmaps that are really common sense and that actually would deploy a lot of the tools and technologies that we already have, a lot of the things that we have at our disposal to make a massive difference. And the McKinsey Institute just came out with an eminent report just recently called The New Climate Economy that was just announced with a bunch of eminent people recently that really does point to a roadmap of looking ahead at $70 trillion worth of investments that are going to be made in the next 15 years in cities, in agriculture, and in energy. What if we actually did certain things here? What would that mean to actually boost our economy, make it better for everybody, help with a lot of development and poverty alleviation goals, and also basically tackle the climate problem all in one fell swoop? And they've laid out that roadmap. So I would say to anybody, kind of pick one of those pieces on the pathways on the roadmap or one of those planetary levers, and then put all your weight behind trying to influence it. And going back to the point that Tom raised before, figure out what the sort of business case is for making that case to whoever the key decision makers are in that area, and just go. In some cases that might mean, and also follow your passion too, so it might mean hang off of a roof with a banner, which really helps sometimes because it does makes people like me seem really sensible. Because I feel like doing that all the time, but I've decided my own role is to do things behind the scenes. But it might also be to just sort of try to do a lot of what Jeff has been doing and others for the last 20 years to kind of figure out ways that you can move the needle without necessarily trying to get credit for it. And that in Washington can be one of the best ways to get things done.
So the New Climate Economy report, it's really terrific. We had a 2-hour session on it right here yesterday afternoon. And just one slight correction, it's actually the product of the Global Commission on the Economy and the Environment, and Jeremy was loaned for a year by McKinsey and Company.
Thank you.
But his talent is clearly all over it. Right?
Thanks.
Two things, too, I think that you might want to consider. One is that pretty much every community in the country is going to be experiencing climate change in some way, and you can look at the National Climate Assessment, you can look at regional assessments, more occurrence of floods, of fires, whatever it is in your neighborhood. I think one of the things is that when people talk about climate change, as individuals, they feel sort of helpless. And that kind of has a slippery slope down to rejecting it, right? Because this is too big, it's too much. I can't do anything about it, I can't see it, and it's not going to happen for many years. I can't deal with it. But what's happening in people's communities right now is you can't get around it. It's happening, right? That 100-year flood is happening every 5 years. These fires that are going on right now in the West, people have to deal with it, and they're not helpless in the face of that. there are things you can do. And I feel like looking at a local level like that about how you adapt to what's already happening is a good path to helping people accept that this is happening and that they need to do more than that. But at least it gives you agency and a way to start thinking and start working in your town, in your community, in your backyard, literally, about how you adapt to what's happening, even if it means you gotta plant different things. I recognize that's not gonna save the world, but it gives people a way to understand and take control of this, so I think can be pretty meaningful, and that you can take people on a straight line from you can't grow that anymore to this is changing and you need to deal with it. As a defense official, people would say, we're telling the guys and the gals, they gotta turn the lights off in the barracks at home. And I'm like, for what I'm trying to do, which is the way they're going through 10 pounds of batteries on a foot patrol. And they're going through millions of gallons, 50 million gallons a month of fuel. In Afghanistan, turning off the lights doesn't make any damn difference. And I think a lot of people feel that way about their personal, when someone says change the light bulb, oh, that's not gonna help. But I think one of the things I was wrong about that, and I accepted that, which is when you teach people the habits at home, that then it can be consequential in other ways. And so that if they're thinking in terms of how I act here at home when I turn off the lights, when I choose not to drive those 2 blocks, that kind of stuff, that it has a meaningful translation in terms of military capabilities and what you're actually getting done where it really matters and where people's lives are at stake. It really did matter. And building in those habits and helping people understand that in a military context, what the efficacy of that was, built a culture and habits that mattered. So even at a personal level, if you may feel like what I do doesn't matter, it does. And it does add up, and it does add to a culture and a habit and throughput. So I'd say also think about the way you live personally.
And an example, power of example for others.
Yeah. Could we capture maybe 2 or 3 questions in a batch, and then I want to make sure we harvest at least enough ideas here. There were a bunch back there, so raise your hands again. And now they're all gone away. Okay, so that's actually good. So maybe we'll go back to the individual questions. Bob Engelman.
David's got one.
Yeah.
And
Hello?
then in the middle.
Is it on?
Yep.
Great. So maybe I'll take advantage of the microphone just to I hope a couple of stories are relevant on your 20th birthday. One is that when PJ and crew started ECSP, I was fairly recently, I just changed. I'm Bob Engelman with the World Watch Institute. I just changed from a career in daily newspapers to being a research person for an advocacy organization on population and family planning. And I guess I got on your list somehow early on. And one thing I recall, and I don't know if I recall it absolutely right, but I recall that the very first rooms where anybody gathered for ECSP were in the castle. It was very exciting for me. I'd known the castle all my life as a Washington native, but I remember going home one time and saying, I actually was in a meeting upstairs in the castle. And it's 1857 building, and it was a tiny room.
Yeah.
I mean, it was nothing like the comfort that the program enjoys today. You had to really be sure you got early to those meetings, because if not, you were standing against a hard wooden wall. And I even think there was one of those sort of roseate windows with tracery. I may be wrong about that, but they were fascinating meetings and helpful to me. I remember one time I was there with a funder who liked something I said at one of the meetings and ended up pouring a bunch of money into my program. So it was a catalytic for me. And then about 5 or 6 years later, Jeff invited me, and my colleague Rich Sincata was with me then at PAI, to go up to Carlisle to the Army War College to play war games. And I remember telling my wife what I was doing. Closest thing I'd done, and closest I'd gotten to the Pentagon, was probably putting flowers in somebody's gun muzzle during the Vietnam War years. But I told my wife I was going up to Carlisle to the Army War College to play war games. She said, this doesn't mean you're thinking about another career change. But I remember being impressed largely through Jeff and through the work that Rich and I did, and then Rich has carried on since with the security community, at how much flexibility there was in that community, how bright those people were, how interested they were in the issues. And it had a very positive effect from a gender perspective, in that it was, I think, Claudia Kennedy, wasn't it, Rich, who then joined PAI's board, the highest ranking woman general at the time. And there was this sense that there was an openness to these ideas that I think that ECSP was really instrumental in bringing together. You could connect things like gender, leadership styles, leadership approaches, security, environment, population, and it was really wonderful stuff. And I guess for me, one of the real questions for the future for Roger Mark and his team is how to keep this going in an era where there's almost a tension about the fact that the problems that the program's been dealing with for 20 years are in fact getting worse. In fact, I don't know whether you remember, Jeff, but that particular war game was built around the idea of a virus that got out of control in East Africa. I very distinctly remember that. And what were the security implications of poor countries in East Africa? I forget whether we named them, but it was roughly Rwanda, Burundi, who were losing their capacity to govern because they were overwhelmed by a virus they couldn't control. I mean, it was foresightful. And yet what's happening with these problems is there's this tension between, on the one hand, we're getting to understand better the interconnections, and on the other, the crises are so bad that just nobody has any time for this. I read something in the Wall Street Journal recently lampooning John Kerry for being interested in oceans and saying, well, at least one good thing about Islamic State and everything else that's going on is John Kerry can forget about oceans. As though the state of the planet, including the oceans, had nothing to do with the other problems that are being created. And the particular area I guess I would ask Roger Mark about is it seems almost more difficult than it was 20 years to connect the status of women and women's contributions to society, their leadership styles, the differences between the way men and women grapple with problems, and something like population dynamics, which is huge and connected to all these, and actual problems. It seems, if anything, harder to do that. Maybe it's just my impression, in spite of all the successes of the program. Are those things that the program is going to continue to fight for, stand up for, and do you have ideas about how you can bridge? For example, next week the United Nations is having 2 daily meetings. On Monday, they're meeting to commemorate another 20th anniversary of the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo in 1994, and the next is the Secretary General's Climate Summit. But neither meeting is going to mention the other in all probability. And this is part of our problem, and I just wonder how can does the program have the support from Wilson Center? Does Wilson Center have the support from the U.S. government and policymakers to keep doing this work? I guess that's my question.
Are you going to take individual questions?
Well,
or are you going to?
Let's just
Let's
answer that
sure.
one.
Yes.
There was one in the middle there. Yeah, I think the answer is yes. Okay.
Yes.
And actually, you send me an email about the juncture of those 2 meetings. I hadn't thought about that in the, maybe I'll get you to do a piece for .earth about that. The irony.
Just to respond quickly, Bob, and you know what I'm particularly grateful about today is that we have the reception afterwards where we can really get into a more detailed discussion on some of these issues over wine. Yeah. But just to say, you know, and I was going to respond to the earlier question that was posed. You know, when I worked at the Sierra Club, we were quite intrigued to discover that the young people that we were working with, young Americans, no longer identified themselves as environmentalists. They identify themselves as climate change activists, number one. And many of them are present in New York City this weekend for what's going on. Number two, they were also changing the way that they mobilize themselves. They no longer felt that they needed to become a member of a Sierra Club. They no longer needed that membership function. They were self-mobilizing. They were doing that in new and innovative ways. And the third thing we discovered is that they did not have baggage that we, many of folks of our generation, have about women's empowerment, population dynamics. And this is something that we see with the young people, the upcoming generation, in our work that we're doing internationally also. So I think there is a momentum there. There is hope there. There is an expectation in the way that they're mobilizing themselves, that they understand these connections, and the way that they are beginning to inform themselves on these issues. So I think certainly our program will continue to build on that momentum. One of the most exciting things for me being here, which I didn't fully recognize looking in from the outside before I joined the Wilson Center, was the degree to which this program has informed other programs at the Wilson Center. And we have actually been we have expanded our purview. We're now a part of a larger initiative at the center that's called a Global Sustainability and Resilience Program, which brings in 4 other programs, and we're very systematically having this go across the DNA of the Wilson Center. So there's yes, yes, and yes, and we can continue talking about this further during the reception. But a great question.
So I think, yeah, right in the dead center of the room.
David Mickle.
Thank you. David Mickle, I direct the Environmental Security Program at the Stimson Center here in Washington. And I know that Roger, to start us off, dreaded the possibility that the panel would be lauding the Environmental Change and Security Program. So let me just take the opportunity from the audience to laud the Environmental Change and Security Program and to congratulate you on your 20th birthday. I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about successful examples, picking up on a theme that you've all evoked, which is integration, cooperation, and coordination. A question from the back asked about what individuals could do. Some of the examples that have been cited from the panel have been within the corporate sector or within the Department of Defense. Jeff recommended to students and activists to learn to speak across languages, and yet no one can be an expert in all things. No one department, no one government can do all things. So part of the solution of integrating to address these megatrends has to be collaboration, has to be teams, as Roger Mark was just saying. If you want to have the tools in place to address these issues 20 years from now, as Sharon was saying, you have to prepare today. The corporate sector, the Department of Defense, to a certain extent, seems to know how to think in these terms. But as PJ said, it's governments and institutions that can provide guidelines and frameworks. And it seems to be governments in this country and elsewhere that aren't thinking ahead 20 years if we want to have the tools in place, if we want to respond to these issues, if we want to achieve success at scale. This is what we can do. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about successful examples of policy, economic, social integration at scale. Just to conclude, one of the reasons I asked this question is I was recently in a meeting where a policymaker said, looking out at a sea of scientists, you know, when scientists want to learn about the issues and know what's coming down the pike, prepare for the future, they talk to each other, they read the literature. When policymakers want to learn something about the future, they mostly talk to other policymakers. It's successful policy examples from another state, from another district, from another jurisdiction that policymakers pay attention to. Do we have successful examples of that type of integration that we could take to our political system, meetings like those coming up in New York, and say, you know, here's how something that has worked, and it's not just me, corporate president or academic saying it, it's this was done in Brazil. There's the example of after Chico Mendes was assassinated. Do we have examples like that you can speak to?
I think there are a few examples, but I'd like to share with you a current example, and I hope that you will interact with my colleagues during the reception. So just this morning, we were having a consultation with our partners from Germany and from the United Kingdom, from Adelphi and International Alert, and we're collaborating with them under an initiative that's helping the G7 think about the interconnectedness of these issues around environmental security. And I don't know if my colleagues can just raise your hands high so folks know who you are, so they talk to you during the reception. But this is coming at the request of a German foreign ministry who has recognized that this is a significant issue. They're bringing on G7 partners as as Germany takes on the presidency of the G7. And the idea is that we're working with our partners on an analysis of the opportunities with regard to environmental security in a context of climate change, and what does this mean? And we are putting in place a platform that would allow for immediate briefings on policy opportunities. And I share that with you because my colleagues are here, but also to say this is a unique mechanism that is being put in place that would allow for up-to-date analysis and providing a framework within the G7 context that allows it to trickle down not only within the G7 countries, but in terms of their international assistance and international collaboration. I think it's very unique, it's terribly exciting, it's opportune, and it's highly unusual, and it's happening now. So I think the fact that it's happening and it's coming at the request of the German government, who has brought on G7 partners, is tremendously significant.
Let's move forward. So,
Yeah,
just
sure.
so we can fit in a couple more questions. Right here in the front, and then, well, we'll get to this.
Hi, I'm Richard Kennedy, a retired CA economic analyst. My daughter had the pleasure of taking Dr. Lovejoy's class in the spring semester. I worked a little bit on environmental issues in the early 90s, enough to be persuaded on the issue of climate change. I was particularly impressed by this book, The Economics of Global Warming by William Klein. Thought he made an impeccable case for action, and I'm kind of discouraged actually by the lack of progress since that book was written. I was a witness at the EPA hearings this summer, but I spend more time on drug law reform because it's a much more tractable issue. My question for the panel is, can somebody say something optimistic about climate change?
I'm not sure that it will necessarily be what you'd like. But I think there's some degree of optimism. When we had these conversations initially, there were a few exchanges in 94, 95 when the program was started about whether climate should be part of the agenda. And it was seen as not to be the focus of discussions because it was slow, incremental future. There was no intentionality given how much the focus was on whether natural resources did or did not contribute to violence. So fast forward to 06, 07, and it was not only a topic of conversation, it was the and potentially the only, which I think has some challenges associated with it as well. And the kids identifying themselves as climate activists rather than a wider lens, particularly as we try to bring what those climate impacts are back down into the communities in real ways, poses a challenge. So it is there on a discussion. And so, which is a first step in dealing with some of the dysfunction that PJ has talked about on the political side and Sharon has. So in that sense, it is, I guess, I don't know whether that's optimism, but as well as having just gone through this process of being on the 5th assessment panel, IPCC, I was very pleased I did it. I don't think I'll ever agree to do it again, even if there is another IPCC, which was a question
For the
in and of itself.
45th COP it was.
Yes,
right?
exactly. But in some ways, while there's still plenty of questions and there's tremendous complexity, the science, as PJ said, is up here. And the politics is the art of the possible in that sense. And so it's not that we have a total lack of understanding of where we're going. We actually have that baseline from which to depart. It's within our realm to have some of this creativity that has come from other areas and apply it and put together the winning coalitions to get there. So don't know, we'll see. See all those people in the streets in New York, whether this weekend give us some.
I just want to say one thing.
Go ahead.
I'm optimistic about one thing. I think the scale issue was all wrong. In the mid-2000s, the climate change problem was being portrayed as a problem that you have to solve. And I think, like what I said about Tim Wirth and Tom Daschle's piece, I think there's a constructive shift toward a realization that climate change is with us. It's a century-scale problem. It will not be solved by one administration, under one Secretary General. It is a new relationship with energy and the climate system that we are evolving. And I think that's actually helpful, that we're seeing an integration of that reality, and it's less like run down the road and put out the fire, because that's not what we're talking about. And with Secretary Ban Ki-moon's Sustainable Energy for All initiative, which is acknowledging that the world needs energy as much as it needs to deal with climate change, is also, I think, a constructive reality-based framing of the problem. So I think we're kind of getting into gear. We are slower than a supertanker, you know, and we're two different supertankers. There's the world that hasn't burned enough fossil fuels yet, and there's the rest of us. and I think that's being acknowledged more and more in a way that I think in the end will benefit the solution space.
So I think if you run down the new climate economy report and just read the executive summary and the key messages, you'll find a lot of hope in that.
Yeah.
Because basically it says that we can meet the 2-degree target without economic disruption.
With economic benefits.
Yeah. And that in fact, some of it is as simple as directing the $70 trillion that will go into new infrastructure in the next 20 years or whatever it is onto a low carbon pathway, all of which exists, right? And the additional point that hasn't really come out in most of the news stories is that an essential part of it involves land use. And this is because there's a significant piece of the excess CO2 in the atmosphere that's come from 3 centuries of destruction and degradation of ecosystems. And with significant levels of restoration from which there are benefits, you can actually pull maybe 0.5 degree or 0.6 degrees of impending climate change out of the system. And the great thing about that is that it takes it away from being a problem that seems so enormous that the average individual can contribute to, just like Victory Gardens, by planting some trees, right? So everybody can make a difference.
And can I just pick up on that for 1 second? Because I think what I've seen in the last 3 years has been a tectonic shift in the private sector towards, first of all, seeing these issues generally from being in the realm of philanthropy to being into core strategic business imperative, for one. But more specifically related to land use, we've seen a massive increase in awareness. It's still relatively low, but it's really risen thanks to the leadership of some unlikely companies like Dow Chemical, Alcoa, and others, that investing in natural infrastructure and the health of healthy ecosystems around the world is oftentimes a much smarter way to deal with a lot of things we care about and to protect a lot of assets and everything else than to build gray infrastructure or to tear the stuff down and try to do man-made solutions. And Alcoa actually discovered this recently by restoring wetlands over the last 8 years in a plant in Latin America. And they've saved like $50 million in the last 8 years by doing that kind of thing. So we've seen an enormous amount of people within the private sector talking about the value of natural infrastructure and understanding how healthy ecosystems, not just in a singular way, but as systems, really will help protect and reinforce a lot of their business interests. And that to me is a real shift in the conversation, to actually take that kind of systems view.
Can we fit in 1 or 2 more, or we're kind of up against it? It's your call.
Are people thirsty?
Yeah, well, maybe it's time to shift the conversation to the more celebratory conversation.
Yeah, so, you know, I would say before we move into the reception, we hope that you'll be able to join us. I'm really appreciate and value the support of the people on this panel. It has been amazing to inherit this from the wonderful directors and to have this family of support. A special thank you to Carmen and her colleagues at USAID who have really allowed us to develop and expand this program over the years, and we look forward to that continued collaboration. It is vital and I think has really made a critical difference. I appreciate that we haven't, we're moving more into the celebration now with the reception, but I would like to acknowledge my colleagues who are here. I am the luckiest person at the Woodrow Wilson Center because I think I have the best team. So I'd like both the scholars who are affiliated with our program and our team to please stand up so that you get public acknowledgement because you're fantastic. So thank you very much. We're moving across the hallway to our dining hall for our reception, where there's wine and lots of goodies. So please stay and continue the conversation.
Did that show up?
That was great. Thank you. You and I need to find some more time.
It may not have
That would be
been.
great.
Chat.
Yeah.
You were talking about that.